The week that rocked British politics. What happens now? Tonight, in a special edition of Newsnight, we're going to try to make sense of quite the most extraordinary political crisis. Booed at today's D-Day commemorations in France, Gordon Brown clings to office back at home. Is he really in power, and for how long? 15 years after Gordon Brown agreed to let Tony Blair run for the leadership, why do the splits between Brownites and Blairites still matter for Labour and for Britain?
That Islington restaurant where the Blair-Brown deal was done has long since changed its name. Desperados. Kind of sums it up.
And we'll hear from some of the sharpest brains in politics and political commentators. Good evening. This has been the most turbulent week in British politics for years, and it's not been about ideas or ideology. It's been about one thing only: power. Can Gordon Brown hold on to it? Can his enemies unseat him? Can the opposition wrest it from him in an early election? The answer to these questions seems to have changed almost day by day throughout this week, as former colleagues knifed the Prime Minister in the back and occasionally in the front too. So where are we this weekend as the politicians draw breath? We begin our special coverage tonight with our political editor, Michael Crick.
Gordon Brown took a break from domestic politics today, visiting Normandy. But even there, he couldn't avoid unpopularity. Booed as he arrived to mark the 65th anniversary of D-Day in 1944. Nor could he avoid the questions over his leadership.
And I think it's important to recognise in these unprecedented times, you're bound to have ups and downs in politics. You're bound to have difficulties because the public are waiting to see the results. But you've got to stick with the policies and make sure that they come through.
As MPs returned after Whitsun, it seemed that with Mr Brown defending Alistair Darling, mostly in the past tense, that the Chancellor was about to lose his job.
Alistair Darling's been a great Chancellor and he's doing very well.
With Brown's Lieutenant Ed Balls due to replace Alistair Darling, this was bound to be a crunch week. Now, Balls is a lot more politically astute than Darling, but also a lot more unpopular with Labour MPs, and not just Blairite MPs. A minister close to Gordon Brown told me that Balls would be a disaster as Chancellor. So whether the Prime Minister would actually manage to replace Darling with Balls would be the big test of his authority. Tuesday was dominated by Jackie Smith saying she'd step down as Home Secretary. Also damaging that night, a long Guardian editorial saying Brown should go. Wednesday, it got worse. Jackie Smith's friend Hazel Blears quit too after rows with Brown. Alan Johnson said he wouldn't be a better PM. But quietly, Johnson's friends were getting ready in case Brown went. Then came news of a backbench plot, an email letter to go round amongst MPs calling on Brown to go.
Although there's always plotting going on, and to some extent there was plotting against Tony Blair, that, in a way, always happens about politics. I think it's a serious mistake if people just see this as a plot by Blairites against Brownites or vice versa. It's much more than that, and I think it's a very difficult position both for the Prime Minister, the party and the government and the country generally.
Thursday started quiet as people voted in the Euro and local elections, but just before polls closed at 10, the shock resignation of James Purnell. Unlike Smith and Blears, he'd not been tipped for the sack, and unlike them, he publicly urged Mr Brown to resign. Purnell's departure came as a real shock to Gordon Brown and Downing Street, but immediately they mounted an overnight rescue operation. Pressure was put on other ministers, such as Caroline Flint, to pledge their loyalty. The organisers of this overnight operation were the two former hatchet men of the Brownite and Blairite factions, once sworn enemies, now working together to save Mr Brown. Ed Balls and Peter Mandelson.
All the cabinet ministers, except few, rally behind Gordon Brown, and definitely Peter Mandelson played his role.
And he's now effectively the Deputy Prime Minister, is he?
I'm not sure whether he is a deputy prime minister or not, but he is very influential member of Gordon Brown's cabinet.
By Friday, James Purnell's going had forced Brown to keep Alistair Darling and, as Foreign Secretary, David Miliband. Ed Balls, who now knew he wouldn't get the Treasury, was curiously absent from Friday's reshuffle work, says one Downing Street figure. It was, he says, a Peter and Gordon show. And Mandelson, deprived of the Foreign Office, a job he'd craved as much as Balls wanted the Treasury, had an extra title, First Secretary of State. Peter Mandelson's central role in the reshuffle explains why several Blairites, Ben Bradshaw, Andy Burnham, Tessa Jowell, Lord Adonis, unexpectedly got promotion, while some of those who'd been tipped for new jobs, such as Shriti Vadera and Sean Woodward, didn't get them. Overall, the reshuffle looked makeshift and extremely shaky. I know that at least one of those who'll be sitting round Mr. Brown's new cabinet table was mulling over on Thursday night whether to join James Purnell in denouncing him. Gordon Brown had just about survived his longest week, but he returns from France to face Euro election results tomorrow night, even worse than yesterday's dreadful council polls. Rebels hope that the showdown will come on Monday night when he meets Labour MPs.
And Michael will be back in just a moment with the latest. But just before we came on air, I spoke to the newly promoted Transport Secretary, Lord Adonis. Well, congratulations, Lord Adonis. I suppose, as Caroline Flint would say, you are part of Gordon Brown's new Blairite window dressing.
Well, it's a real privilege to be part of the new cabinet. And I was a transport minister before. I'm now transport secretary. We have a big agenda of change in transport, seeking to build, in particular, a much better railway as we look to the possibility of developing high-speed railway lines, which is part of our wider vision for the future.
Sorry to interrupt, but what he's done is he's put people like Lord Mandelson, you, Ben Bradshaw, clearly Blairites in important positions because this is a weak prime minister with a hugely divided party, and he's trying to stitch it together.
I don't think that's a fair view at all. We have a united cabinet with what I believe is essentially a united party, and it's right that all strands of opinion in the party are represented. Now, there are plenty of us who've been engaged in the party for many years, helping to develop the policies which have proved so successful over the last few general elections.
Well, elections, I was going to come to that.
And improving the public services.
You're one of those who has not fought in a general election. I mean, there's you, there's now Lord Mandelson, there's Lord Sugar is coming in as an advisor, there's Glenys Kinnock, who is no longer an MEP. She's going to be in the House of Lords. 12 years of Labour, you've got more people from the House of Lords, unelected people running this country, including the Prime Minister, actually, who's not faced the electorate in an election, and fewer women in Cabinet. Is this really what you want?
Well, all cabinets have some members who are drawn from the House of Lords, and that's perfectly right and proper, so that you get some people who can be drawn from a wider pool than simply membership of the House of Commons. But the legitimacy of a government, of course, depends entirely on election in the House of Commons, and that's the same with us. And we have a strong government which represents all strands of opinion in the Labour Party, but more to the point, it's resolutely focused on producing a blueprint for a better future for Britain, and that, I believe, is what people expect us to get on with.
Let's look at the blueprint. I mean, one of the things that's coming up is part privatisation of the Royal Mail. And you know that the left is your party, cannot stomach it, and you know that Lord Mandelson wants it, and you can't please both of them. So which will you please?
Well, to govern is to choose. We have to take decisions. You can't duck important decisions like this.
So you're telling the left to get lost?
No, Gordon Brown and Peter Mandelson haven't ducked the decision. That's not to say we don't discuss these issues properly before, but, I've been engaged in government now one way and another for the last 10 years. Many of those things which have produced the biggest improvements in the public services, choice in the health service, the development of academies in schools, you talked about modernising the Royal Mail, all of these things are very difficult because, of course, there are strong vested interests.
But you've got a weak Prime Minister with a divided party. The left don't want it. We're going to hear from John Cruddas in the papers tomorrow saying effectively more left-wing policies. I mean, it's very difficult for Gordon Brown to keep this ship all rowing in the same direction.
Well, the policies we need are the correct policies. And, of course, investment in the public services. And we've been investing a huge amount more in health, education, transport, law and order and so on in recent years. That is traditionally, of course, a policy that was seen as a left-wing policy. Modernising the public services by introducing more choice, more diversity, a stronger set of rights for consumers, that's traditionally been seen as a more market-based policy.